This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. We've got a stacked show tonight, so let's get into it. Tonight, our award-winning Newsy Bellingcat series reconstructs the storming of the Capitol and breaks down the national security concerns with congressional offices compromised. Plus, the push from the FBI and other law enforcement agencies to arrest and charge members of the violent pro-Trump mob. But first, here's what you need to know right now.
The gleeful desecration of the U.S. Capitol, which is the temple of our American democracy, and the violence targeting Congress are horrors that will forever stain our nation's history, instigated by the President of the United States.
Lawmakers are pushing to remove President Trump from office, even with less than 2 weeks left in his term. Of course, this comes after Trump encouraged a violent mob to descend on the U.S. Capitol Wednesday.
You'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong.
Today, a growing list of Democrats and even some Republican lawmakers are calling for the 25th Amendment to be invoked, with Senate Democrats leader Chuck Schumer saying, "This president must not hold office one day longer." The 25th Amendment empowers Congress to establish a permanent body that, acting with the vice president and a majority of the cabinet, can declare the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. Meanwhile, many Democrats, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, are urging Congress to pick up impeachment hearings against the president today. Some White House officials are also withdrawing support for Trump and stepping down over the Capitol riot. The Deputy National Security Advisor, the Chief of Staff for the First Lady, and Mick Mulvaney, who has played several roles for the Trump administration, have all resigned. At least 3 other aides are said to be considering the same move.
Those who choose to stay, and I have talked to a couple of them, are choosing to stay because they are concerned that the president might put someone in to replace them that could make things even worse.
As Trump's support dwindles on Capitol Hill, his social media accounts are also taking a hit. Facebook announced today it would indefinitely suspend the president's account at least through the end of his term, while Twitter initially locked Trump out for at least 12 hours. More than 50 people were arrested during the riots at the U.S. Capitol Wednesday, but many people who walked free could now face criminal charges. We made some calls today to law enforcement and to legal experts who say the rioters committed several local and federal crimes ranging from misdemeanors to felonies. That includes vandalism, rioting, trespassing on federal facilities, assault, and weapons-related crimes, all the way up to some of the more serious charges around sedition and insurrection. It's worth noting the grounds of the U.S. Capitol are governed by a separate set of specific statutes as it pertains to unlawful acts. Several U.S. attorneys have taken to social media to say members of the mob would be prosecuted, including those who crossed state lines into D.C. to participate in the riots. The FBI has set up a website for anyone who has tips on identifying people suspected of breaking into the Capitol.
Violence never wins. Freedom wins. And this is still the people's house. And as we reconvene in this chamber, the world will again witness the resilience and strength of our democracy.
Congress officially certified Joe Biden as the 46th president of the United States, despite interruptions and delays caused by the mobs of Trump supporters. Also delaying certification, Senators Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, who have continued to object to vote counts despite mountains of evidence upholding the totals, and even after other Republicans pulled back their objections following the Capitol riots. As the certified results came down, lawmakers focused on what's next.
We need to find a way to move forward. We need to make sure that the terrorists from yesterday are tracked down and put in prison. We need to make sure that we are pushing for the safety of this country over the next couple of weeks.
Let's get real for a minute. If black people stormed the Capitol, they wouldn't have made it past the front steps alive. Full stop. It's a double standard that is infuriating, but also just a clear sign of how people are policed differently based on the color of their skin. To recap, on Wednesday, groups of mostly white people incited by the president wearing MAGA headgear and flying an array of flags stormed the Capitol, fist-fought with police, busted out glass, trespassed, put the U.S. Congress on lockdown, entered the chambers, sat in the offices of lawmakers, leisurely walked through the building like they were on a tour, and ultimately took selfies with police. This was the first time the Capitol was breached since 1814, when the British set it on fire. And most of the mob just walked out of the Capitol freely and went about their day. So here's some contrast for you. During DC's summer of racial reckoning following the death of George Floyd, law enforcement were out in full force. National Guard members from 11 states and DC were mobilized to combat protesters, and hundreds of people were arrested over a few days. One of the most intense clashes happened June 1st, the day of the president's photo op at St. John's Church. The White House and other federal sites were being protected by local law enforcement as well as the Secret Service, U.S. Park Police, Capitol Police, ATF personnel, the Marshal Service, the Bureau of Prisons, CBP, and ICE. Peaceful protesters were beaten and pepper sprayed so the president could pose with a Bible. Later that night, 2 DC Army National Guard helicopters broke airspace regulations to fly over demonstrators and injure one protester, dispersing them by picking up gale force winds with their rotor blades. When law enforcement wanted to suppress crowds of people, they did it. So what was different about yesterday? The people who terrorized the Capitol weren't met with half the force Black protesters have seen during demonstrations where they've asserted that their lives mattered or demanded an end to racial injustice or decried police brutality. Now, ultimately, 4 people died Wednesday. I saw a tweet that really summed up how I felt. We're not asking for you to shoot them like you shoot us. We're asking you to not shoot us like you don't shoot them. The Capitol riot was egregious and just so abnormal for so many reasons. But another distinctive aspect of it was just how visible it all was. Filmed, tweeted, and live streamed from hundreds of different sources out onto the World Wide Web. Jake Godin with our Emmy-nominated Newsy Bellingcat series dug through dozens of those videos and put together a visual timeline of the mob's Capitol break-in and the national security concerns they caused.
Stop the steal! Stop the steal! Stop the steal!
The riot began as a rally protesting the results of the presidential election, attended by the president himself.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
But as the president was speaking on the National Mall, protests at the Capitol were already growing riotous. At around 2 p.m. Eastern Time, protesters stormed the Capitol building, scaling walls, smashing windows, and tearing down barricades. The rioters met only limited resistance from a heavily outnumbered police presence. The buildup of Trump supporters took place mainly at 2 locations surrounding the Capitol building, at the west entrance and on the east entrance. Both sides had large groups of supporters pushing back against a thin police presence. As protesters on the west side circumvented the police line blocking the front entrance, other police just sat and watched as they streamed into the Capitol's Senate wing through a shattered window and doorways. On the east side of the Capitol, a large buildup of Trump supporters swarmed the police line and eventually forced the police to retreat back towards the Capitol steps.
Wow, they made it, dude!
They then made their way to the central entrance where they attempted to get into the building. The sparse police presence inside the Capitol was overwhelmed. Baked Alaska, a neo-Nazi activist, was streaming video as he entered an office on the building's ground floor.
Hey, whose office is this? Let's call Trump, yes! I can call the U.S. Senate, apparently.
Turns out it was Oregon Senator Jeff Merkley's hideaway office. He posted a video of the ransacked room later in the evening.
You can see the debris all over the floor.
One of the more grim incidents of the night occurred here, right outside the doors of the Speaker's lobby near the House chamber where members of Congress were evacuating. Packing the hallway, Trump supporters ran up against Capitol Police, blocking the door to the Speaker's lobby. As more police arrived, the ones guarding the door left, giving the Trump supporters a chance to break the windows leading into the lobby. A clock visible above the lobby doors shows that the time was approximately 2:44 p.m. 2 minutes later, a woman, later identified as Ashley Babbitt, attempts to climb through the window and is shot by a guard on the other side. The area she was entering would have provided access to the House chamber, where other images from the night showed guards pointing guns at Trump supporters trying to break into the barricaded front door. One bright spot, it's unlikely any classified data was stolen during the riot. Congressional computers don't have access to that kind of information outside of specialized rooms.
For a lot of congressional staff, the information they deal with is unclassified, and a lot of it becomes public record anyway. And so it's, from that perspective, not particularly sensitive that it gets out.
Still, exposed emails and documents could contain sensitive information, and the security breach offered bad actors the chance to plant bugs or other devices, meaning Congress will consider those areas of the Capitol as potentially compromised.
When you're back, we'll tell you what law enforcement is doing about the mob of people who stormed the Capitol. As we said before, a lot of people were able to just walk out of the Capitol building yesterday without much of a fuss. Just this morning, the FBI put out a call for tips and digital content to help identify people who stormed the building. So, how are other agencies pursuing arrests and holding members of the mob accountable? Newsy's Teak Root and Mark Greenblatt take a closer look.
It was a day filled with shocking images of rioters storming the U.S. Capitol, roaming freely on the Senate floor, posing for pictures in congressional offices, destroying property, and forcing a mass evacuation. It took police hours to drive out the mob, and in their wake, 4 people died. More than 50 police were injured, and officers confiscated guns and explosive devices. This photographer was thrown around by the crowd like a rag doll. Capitol Police said they arrested 14 people that day, and in a statement, the Capitol Police Chief said his department had a robust plan established to address anticipated First Amendment activities. But make no mistake, these mass riots were not First Amendment activities. But many were left with the questions about why were there so few arrested on the scene? Assailants were seen going free without being detained. One officer even took a selfie with the assailants. On Thursday, Senator Chuck Schumer said he would fire the sergeant-at-arms who oversees the Capitol Police when Democrats take control of the Senate. D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser called the attacks a textbook case of terrorism that could not go unpunished.
I also call on the Joint Terrorism Task Force to investigate, arrest, and prosecute any individual who entered the Capitol, destroyed property, or incited acts of domestic terrorism observed yesterday.
The acting U.S. Attorney General announced our criminal prosecutors have been working throughout the night with special agents and investigators to gather the evidence, identify perpetrators, and charge federal crimes where warranted. D.C. police said Thursday that 68 arrests were made, mostly after a 6 p.m. curfew was in place. And they've now posted pictures of more persons of interest online and are asking the public's help in identifying and locating those responsible, saying they'll share any tips with the FBI. They also have technology. The National Capital Regional Facial Recognition Investigative Lead System can compare images from crime scenes against a large database of mugshots. Authorities did use the program to identify and arrest a Black Lives Matter protester in Lafayette Square outside the White House last June. But the governmental counsel in charge of it tells Newsy that it has not been contacted to help identify Capitol Hill rioters, saying at this time, staff is not aware of any request for access to the database. Among those, D.C. police say they're looking to identify this man. Jake Angeli, a well-known QAnon supporter, sometimes referred to as the QAnon shaman, and a fixture in right-wing Arizona politics. At the time we called him, he said he had not yet been contacted by anyone in law enforcement.
I'm worried about it because, in all honesty, like I said, I didn't do anything wrong. You know, I didn't break any laws. I walked through open doors. You know, I took a picture.
But D.C. police say he is a person of interest, and Angeli let us know the one person who could have ended his own participation in the siege sooner.
I trust the president. And, you know, being a veteran myself and being part of the Super Soldier program, I obey the orders of the President of the United States.
Angeli told us he might even come back to D.C. for the inauguration. Mark Greenblatt, Newsy.
So today makes it official. After 4 years of Trump, Democrats will control the House, the Senate, and the White House. That's enough to give you some political whiplash. And it opens all sorts of possibilities for the Democrats in charge. Maybe the quickest and most anticipated possibility, approving another round of stimulus checks for Americans, this time maxing out at $2,000 per check. That was basically a Georgia campaign promise from the incoming president.
Because their election will put an end to the block in Washington that $2,000 stimulus check. That money that will go out the door immediately. Tell people who are in real trouble.
And speaking of the president-elect, controlling the Senate means Democrats won't necessarily need to rely on Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans to confirm presidential appointments. For instance, you can expect easy passage for most of Biden's cabinet picks, as well as judicial appointments. If Republicans had kept Senate control, McConnell would have had a lot of say over confirmation for any nominations. Now Chuck Schumer and the Democrats have the reins in the Senate.
For too long, much-needed help has been stalled or diluted by a Republican-led Senate and President Trump. That will change.
What a 50-50 Senate essentially does is it gives the Biden administration and the Democrats the ability to kind of set the agenda.
But in order to pass almost all major legislation, Bipartisan Policy Center President Jason Grummett tells us Democrats in the Senate will need more than just a majority.
A key premise of American democracy, which differentiates our approach from kind of parliamentary systems, is we have baked in this idea that the minority party gets a bigger voice. And the way that we have created this obligation for members of Congress to collaborate is the filibuster, which in the Senate allows the minority party to essentially demand a 60-vote threshold, which usually means you have to get a few of them on board to pass important legislation.
Now, the last time Democrats held control of all three branches of government was early in President Obama's presidency. At that point, there was a lot of talk of reaching across the aisle and not spending too much political capital. So, moving forward on things like expanding the Affordable Care Act, a new Voting Rights Act, legislation on climate change, and maybe even statehood for DC or Puerto Rico. That's going to require building consensus with moderate Democrats and across the aisle with a few Republicans. Also, keep in mind that 50 Democrats in the Senate doesn't mean 50 progressive Democrats in the Senate. Winning over moderates like Joe Manchin of West Virginia will be key for a wide range of new priorities when the new president takes office in 2 weeks. Trump is scheduled to pack up and leave the White House on January 20th, but some members of Congress want to expedite his departure. During a rally in DC yesterday and before Congress was able to confirm the results of the election, President Trump told his supporters, "If you don't fight like hell, we're not going to have a country anymore." Not long after that, his supporters stormed the Capitol. In the aftermath, some members of Congress are calling for Vice President Mike Pence to begin removal procedures just weeks before President Trump leaves office. Newsy's Amber Strong explains how that would work.
The aftermath of Wednesday's events at the U.S. Capitol led to almost immediate finger-pointing, with many laying the blame at the feet of the president.
Violence at the Capitol quickly leading to accusations.
This mob was inspired by a president who cannot accept defeat.
This mob was in good part President Trump's doing.
The NAACP, governors, and prominent trade groups all calling for the president's removal, either through impeachment or invoking the 25th Amendment. That includes the Senate Minority Leader and a member of the president's own party.
The president caused this. The president is unfit, and the president is unwell. And the president must now relinquish control of the executive branch voluntarily or involuntarily.
Neither process is easy. Let's start with the 25th Amendment. The vice president would need to invoke the amendment, believing the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. If a majority of the cabinet agrees, the president is out. But an appeal from the president would ultimately put the decision in the hands of Congress, which must approve the removal by a 2/3 majority in both houses.
25th Amendment was designed to address incapacity with the basic paradigm example being a medical or physical inability to carry out the duties of the office.
However, the term unable to discharge duties has been up for debate. The impeachment process would also remove the president, but carries different long-term consequences than the 25th Amendment.
That does not carry with it the condemnation of impeachment and conviction. it does not disqualify Trump from future offices. It does not reflect any official opinion that he's engaged in sedition.
Now, both processes could take place at the same time. There's nothing preventing that. However, some caution that removing the president at this point could spark further violence. Amber Strong, Newsy, Northern Virginia.
If you haven't done so already, feel free to reach out to us on Twitter using the hashtag NewsyInTheLoop. Do me a favor, hit me with something non-news related. I'm a little news drunk right now. I could use a palate cleanser. Yesterday's attack on the Capitol didn't happen in a vacuum. While a lot of us tuned in to follow the chaos, so did people from around the world, including world leaders. Newsy's Ben Shamiso spoke to experts who say the events that took place could hurt U.S. credibility and benefit our rivals abroad.
Et on prend tout de suite la direction de Washington.
Images of a violent mob invading the seat of the world's most powerful democracy stunned people around the world and dealt one more blow to America's global credibility.
You're already going from a case of where the U.S. reputation was not sterling to bringing it down further.
One after the other, foreign leaders lectured the U.S. on the importance of a peaceful and orderly transfer of power, issuing the type of statements the U.S. often uses itself to condemn political violence abroad.
It's certainly going to make it more difficult for the United States to maintain a consistent position in support of democratic movements around the world.
The irony wasn't lost on America's rivals and countries used to being sanctioned or criticized by the U.S. government.
The Arab media highlighting the hypocrisy of the United States' frequent lectures about democracy. China highlighting America's praising Hong Kong demonstrators while this goes on in the United States.
While officials in China, Russia, and Iran sought to embarrass the U.S., allies remained hopeful about the incoming Biden administration and the resilience of the U.S. democracy.
You could also view this as the ultimate stress test for the U.S. system, and to see that in the end, it held. That there was this event, it happened, it was disturbing, but it was resolved.
Political analysts say the DC riot makes it crystal clear that the world doesn't take America's democracy for granted.
We have to be very aware that that's how people are perceiving us.
The United States probably needs to be careful on how it talks to other countries about their political systems without giving up, I think, on the idealism of human rights and democracy.
To heal the U.S. reputation in the world, experts say the Biden administration will need to heal divisions at home and tackle the pandemic.
The focus on a domestic tranquility would actually strengthen the foreign policy voice of the United States.
Ben Shamiso, Newsy.
So how exactly do we describe what happened yesterday? I mean, it was criminal for sure. People have used descriptors ranging from protest to insurrection, even domestic terrorism. Newsy's Casey Mendoza takes a closer look at how media talked about the Capitol attack and why the spectrum of that verbiage matters.
In the aftermath of the chaos on Capitol Hill, where 4 people died and an armed standoff occurred in the House chamber, media outlets, politicians, and political experts are trying to find the words to explain exactly what happened.
Violent chaos and anarchy.
Protesters up there.
Insurrectionists. Domestic terrorists.
It really was a mob.
Some words like protest and riot were used almost interchangeably, but the implications of each term matters, especially when it comes to accurately describing the violence that occurred.
Some people are going to want to use words that minimize what happened because they don't want to be tied to such extreme behavior.
In a sample of more than 100 different online articles from 17 different news outlets published over the course of the day, Newsy found the most common words used to describe the Capitol breach were violence, protest, mob, and riot. Some have criticized the use of the word protest, and one expert explained to Quartz, it's because the word gives this veneer of a legitimate form of participation in the democratic process. Outlets like the Associated Press or the Washington Post opted for violent protest, rioting protesters, or mob instead, while other experts and outlets like NPR chose to use more aggressive terms like pro-Trump extremists committing acts of insurrection.
But make no mistake about it, this hasn't happened for 200 years. And so to say that it's a riot along the lines of people after a Big Ten football game or something is ridiculous.
It's not protest, it's insurrection.
Alongside President-elect Joe Biden, former President George W. Bush, and Republican Senator Mitt Romney also notably used the term insurrection to describe yesterday's events. More than mob or riot, the word specifies a violent uprising against authority, and it carries both historical precedence and legal implications in the U.S. Code.
This was a deliberate effort to block the actions of the U.S. Congress. And using violence to stop lawmaking, to shut the government down, even for a few hours, is the very definition of something beyond a riot.
Casey Mendoza, Newsy, Chicago.
Okay, I think that's enough news for right now. As always, thanks for watching, y'all. I'm going to sign off here and from all social media accounts for the next little while, but we'll be back for more in the loop next week. Same time, same place. Top stories from Newsy are headed your way right now.